The mahogany conference table gleamed under the soft LED lighting as Darius Williams adjusted his charcoal suit jacket and leaned forward, his dark eyes scanning the faces of the 12 board members seated around him. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, barely audible over the rustling of papers and the soft clicks of expensive pens against legal pads. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, the city sprawled beneath them like a living organism, its arteries of light pulsing with the rhythm of evening traffic. The Riverside Youth Foundation will transform over 3,000 lives in the next 5 years, Darius said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had built Tech Vision Solutions from a basement startup into a $100 million empire. Our projections show that for every dollar invested in these underprivileged communities, we'll see a $7 return in reduced crime, increased graduation rates, and economic development. Margaret Chen, the Foundation's chief financial officer, nodded approvingly from her seat to his right. Her silver hair caught the light as she turned to address the room. The audit trail is impeccable. Every cent has been accounted for. Every program vetted by independent consultants. She slid a thick folder across the polished surface. The community impact studies speak for themselves. Darius felt the familiar surge of pride that came with presenting work that mattered. This wasn't just another tech contract or software license deal. This was about Marcus, the 15-year-old who'd approached him after a school assembly, eyes bright with possibility, despite the worn sneakers and patched backpack. This was about Sheila, the single mother who'd asked him if there was really hope for kids like hers. The foundation wasn't just a tax write-off or a corporate responsibility checkbox. It was his legacy, his way of pulling up the ladder he'd climbed. The boardroom door burst open with such violence that the heavy wood panel slammed against the wall, sending a framed certification crashing to the marble floor. The sharp crack of splintering glass cut through the air like a gunshot, and several board members jumped in their seats. Darius's head snapped toward the sound, his body tensing with the instinctive awareness that comes from growing up in neighborhoods where unexpected noise often meant danger. Officer Karen Millfield stood in the doorway like an avenging angel of bureaucratic fury, her HOA badge glinting on her uniformed chest, and her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent scowl. Her pale blue eyes swept the room with the predatory intensity of a hawk circling prey. And when they landed on Darius, her thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so cold. Darius Williams. Her voice cracked like a whip across the stunned silence. You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and theft of community funds. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Margaret's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto her legal pad. Board member James Harrison's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, steam still rising from the ceramic rim. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant rumble of traffic 42 floors below. Darius rose slowly from his chair, his hands visible and steady on the table's edge. 3 decades of navigating corporate boardrooms had taught him to project calm, even when his mind was racing. But this wasn't a hostile takeover or a difficult negotiation. This was something else entirely, something that made his skin prickle with the memory of every traffic stop, every suspicious glance, every time he'd been followed through a department store by security. I'm sorry, Officer Millfield. Is it? His voice remained level, professional. I think there's been some kind of mistake. I'm in the middle of a board meeting for my charitable foundation. Karen stepped further into the room, her heavy boots clicking against the marble with the rhythm of a funeral march. Behind her, 2 security guards from the building shifted nervously in the hallway, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to challenge someone in uniform. No mistake, Williams. She pulled a manila folder from under her arm and slapped it onto the conference table with enough force to make the water glasses jump. "We've been investigating your little operation for months. Money laundering, tax evasion, diverting funds meant for poor kids into your own pockets." The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Margaret's face went pale, her hand instinctively moving to cover her mouth. Board member Sandra Rodriguez leaned back in her chair as if trying to distance herself from the words. But Darius noticed something else in the collective reaction, something that made his stomach tighten with familiar dread. It was the subtle shift in posture, the barely perceptible lean away from him, the way eyes that had been warm and approving moments before now carried a flicker of doubt. "These are serious allegations," Margaret said carefully, her lawyer's training kicking in. "But surely this could be handled through proper channels? Perhaps we should—" Proper channels. Karen's laugh was harsh and brittle. "This white-collar criminal has been stealing from children from the community. How's that for your precious proper channels?" Darius felt the words like physical blows. Not just the accusations, but the way she said white-collar criminal, loading those two words with enough venom to poison a well. He'd heard that tone before, had seen that look in eyes that saw him not as a successful entrepreneur or philanthropist, but as something that didn't belong in these marble and mahogany spaces. "Officer Millfield," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "I invite you to examine our books. Every transaction is documented and audited by external firms. The Foundation has received clean reports for the past 5 years." Karen's eyes narrowed to slits. "Oh, I'm sure you've got your stories straight. People like you always do." She opened the manila folder with theatrical flourish, pulling out a sheaf of papers that rustled like autumn leaves. "But we have evidence. Bank transfers, secret accounts, forged documents." She began spreading papers across the conference table, each one landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the stunned silence. The documents looked official, stamped and signed, with numbers and dates that danced before the eyes of the board members. But as Darius leaned forward to examine them, his trained eye caught inconsistencies that made his blood run cold. The letterhead was wrong. Not obviously wrong, but subtly off, like a photograph that had been slightly out of focus. The bank routing numbers didn't match any institution he'd ever worked with. The signature that was supposed to be his looked like it had been traced by someone with shaky hands. "These documents are fabricated," he said quietly, but his words were lost in the shuffle as Karen continued her performance. "Mr. Williams has been living like a king while children go without after-school programs, without tutoring, without hope." She pulled out her phone and began dialing with aggressive jabs at the screen. "Channel 7 News. This is Officer Millfield with the Riverside HOA. I'm calling to report a major breaking story." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "Now wait just a minute. You can't just barge in here and start calling the media without—" "Without what? Without giving him time to shred more evidence to transfer more money offshore?" Karen's voice rose to a near shout. "I've got a public duty to protect this community from predators." The word predators hung in the air like a curse. Darius felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar weight that he'd carried since childhood. It was the weight of being presumed guilty, of having to prove his innocence instead of having it assumed. It was the weight of knowing that no matter how successful he became, how much he gave back, how carefully he lived his life, there would always be someone ready to tear it all down with nothing more than suspicion and a handful of lies. James Harrison, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should postpone this meeting until these allegations can be properly investigated." The words felt like a betrayal, even though Darius understood the logic. The foundation couldn't afford to be associated with scandal, real or manufactured. But understanding didn't make it hurt less when Sandra Rodriguez began gathering her papers, when Michael Torres avoided his eyes, when the room that had been filled with optimism and possibility just minutes before now felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Karen finished her phone call and turned back to the room with a satisfaction that made Darius's skin crawl. The news crew will be here in 15 minutes. I suggest you start cooperating, Williams, unless you want this to get even uglier. Cooperating with what? Darius's voice carried an edge for the first time. You've presented no valid evidence, no proper warrant, no legal standing to be here. This is harassment, plain and simple. Karen's face flushed red, the color rising from her neck like mercury in a thermometer. Legal standing. I represent the community, I protect honest, hard-working families from people like you who think you can buy your way out of everything. She pulled out another set of papers, these ones bearing the official seal of the city's Department of Financial Services. These are freeze orders for all of your company's accounts, every penny, every transaction, locked down until we get to the bottom of this. Margaret snatched the papers from Karen's hands, her eyes scanning the legal language with practiced speed. Her face went from pale to ashen. This can't be legal. These accounts fund payroll for over 300 employees. You can't just... I can, and I did. Karen's smile was razor sharp. When someone steals from children, they forfeit their right to do business as usual. Darius felt the walls closing in around him. Not just the walls of the conference room, but the walls of a system that had been designed to give people like Karen the power to destroy people like him on nothing more than accusation and innuendo. The foundation's accounts were clean, audited annually by one of the city's most respected accounting firms. But that wouldn't matter if the narrative had already been written. The elevator chimed softly in the distance, and footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Darius's heart sank as he realized the news crew had arrived faster than expected. In moments, cameras would be rolling, and his reputation, built over decades of careful work and community service, could be destroyed in a 30-second soundbite. But then, the footsteps stopped, and a familiar voice cut through the chaos with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. What exactly is going on here? Darius turned toward the door, and for the first time since Karen had burst into the room, he felt something other than dread. Standing in the doorway was Vivian Williams, his wife of 15 years. Her tailored navy suit immaculate despite the obvious haste with which she'd arrived. Her dark hair was pulled back in a chignon that had somehow remained perfect, and her brown eyes held the same quiet intensity that had made her the youngest bank president in the city's history. Karen's triumphant expression faltered slightly. "Ma'am, this is an official investigation. I'm going to have to ask you to..." "You're going to ask me to what?" Vivian stepped fully into the room, and Darius noticed that she wasn't alone. Behind her stood David Chen, the foundation's legal counsel, and behind him, a woman Darius recognized as Sarah Martinez, the investigative reporter from Channel 11. Vivian's eyes swept the scattered papers on the conference table, taking in the scene with the analytical precision that had made her one of the most feared negotiators in the financial district. "Officer Millfield, isn't it? I believe we've met before." Karen's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. "Mrs. Williams, I didn't realize you were involved in this situation." Involved. Vivian's laugh was musical, but there was steel underneath the melody. "Officer Millfield, I'm the president of Metropolitan Trust Bank, the same bank that holds the primary accounts for both Tech Vision Solutions and the Riverside Youth Foundation. So, yes, I'd say I'm quite involved. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret straightened in her chair, a gleam of hope returning to her eyes. James Harrison looked up from his coffee cup for the first time since Karen had entered. But it was the expression on Karen's face that told Darius everything he needed to know about how dramatically the situation had just shifted. Vivian moved to the conference table and began examining the papers Karen had scattered there, her manicured fingers picking up document after document with the delicate precision of a surgeon. These are interesting. David, would you take a look at these bank statements? David Chen stepped forward, his own eyes widening as he examined the documents. Mrs. Williams, these routing numbers, they don't correspond to any bank in our network. And this account number format hasn't been used by Metropolitan Trust in over a decade. Exactly what I was thinking. Vivian held up one of the papers to the light, and Darius could see the watermark was wrong. The paper stock too thin. The printing slightly blurred. Officer Millfield, where exactly did you obtain these documents? Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. They were provided by a reliable source within the banking community. A reliable source. Vivian set the papers down carefully, aligning them with the edge of the table. Would this reliable source happen to have a name, credentials, any actual connection to Metropolitan Trust Bank? The silence stretched like a taut wire. Outside, the city continued its evening rhythm, unaware of the drama playing out 42 floors above. Inside the conference room, the only sound was the whisper of air conditioning and the distant rumble of traffic that seemed suddenly very far away. Sarah Martinez, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward with her phone already recording. Officer Millfield, are you saying you initiated a criminal investigation and froze corporate assets based on forged documents? Karen's hand moved instinctively toward her radio, but she stopped herself. These documents are... The investigation is ongoing. I don't have to explain my methods to the bank president whose institution you've falsely implicated in fraud. Vivian's voice remained perfectly level, but there was something in her tone that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. Officer Millfield, I'm going to need you to explain how you obtained what appear to be forged Metropolitan Trust documents bearing my bank's letterhead. David Chen was now photographing the documents with his phone, his legal training evident in the methodical way he captured each piece of evidence. Mrs. Williams, I think we should also discuss the freeze orders. The city's Department of Financial Services doesn't have the authority to freeze accounts at Metropolitan Trust without going through proper federal banking channels. Margaret stood again, this time with renewed confidence. Are you saying those freeze orders are as fake as the bank statements? Vivian examined the freeze orders with the same careful attention she'd given the bank documents. Her expression grew darker with each line she read. Officer Millfield, these orders reference federal banking regulations that don't exist. The statute numbers are wrong, the authorization codes are incorrect, and the signatures. She looked up, her eyes meeting Karen's with the intensity of a laser. The signatures are forged. The word forged hung in the air like a death sentence. Karen's face had gone from purple to gray, and small beads of sweat were beginning to form on her forehead, despite the cool air conditioning. You can't prove any of that. Those documents are legitimate, obtained through proper channels. Which channels? Sarah Martinez had moved closer, her phone capturing every word. Can you name the specific federal agency that provided these freeze orders? The judge who signed off on the bank document requests? Karen's mouth opened and closed again, but no words came out. She looked around the room as if searching for an ally, but found only faces that had moved from confusion to understanding to something approaching anger. The board members who had been ready to distance themselves from Darius minutes before were now looking at Karen with the kind of disgust reserved for people who prey on children. Vivian pulled out her own phone and began dialing. "David, I think it's time we called the real authorities. The FBI has a financial crimes division that takes a very dim view of people who impersonate federal banking officials." FBI. Karen's voice cracked on the letters. "You can't. This is just a misunderstanding. Maybe the documents got mixed up. Maybe there was some confusion at the office." Confusion. Darius spoke for the first time since Vivian had arrived, and his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room turn toward him. "Officer Millfield, you accused me of stealing from children. You called me a predator, a white-collar criminal. You tried to destroy my reputation, my business, my life's work, based on documents you knew were fake." He stood slowly, his full height imposing even in the spacious conference room. "So, let me ask you directly, was this confusion? Or was this deliberate?" Karen's face cycled through several expressions before settling on something that looked like desperation. "You people think you can just buy your way into our neighborhoods, throw money around, and suddenly you belong. But I know what you're really after. I know what people like you do when you get power." The mask had finally slipped completely. The words hung in the air like poison gas, and Darius felt the familiar ache in his chest that came from having his worst suspicions confirmed. This hadn't been about embezzlement or fraud or protecting children. This had been about putting him in his place, about reminding him that no matter how successful he became, there would always be people who saw him as an interloper, a threat, something that needed to be contained. Vivian's phone call connected, and her voice took on the crisp, professional tone she used for bank business. "Special Agent Rodriguez. This is Vivian Williams, at Metropolitan Trust. I need to report an attempted fraud involving forged federal banking documents." Karen made a break for the door, but Sarah Martinez was already blocking her path. Phone still recording. "Officer Millfield, are you fleeing a federal crime scene?" "I'm not fleeing anything." But Karen's voice was shrill now, panic evident in every syllable. "This is harassment. You can't just accuse an officer of the law." "Of what? Of fabricating evidence, of impersonating federal officials, of filing false reports." David Chen had finished photographing the documents and was now taking notes on his phone. "Because those are exactly the charges that are going to be filed." Margaret had moved to Darius's side, her face a mixture of relief and anger. "Darius, I'm so sorry. I should have realized immediately that something was wrong. The way she burst in here, the theatrics, the obvious forgeries." "Don't apologize, Margaret." Darius's voice was tired but steady. "This wasn't about obvious or subtle. This was about the fact that when someone in uniform accuses a black man of a crime, people's first instinct is to believe the uniform." The words landed with the force of truth, and several board members had the grace to look ashamed. James Harrison cleared his throat. "Darius, we should have asked more questions, should have demanded to see proper warrants, should have insisted on legal representation before." "Should have, could have, would have." Darius shook his head. "The important thing now is making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Vivian finished her phone call and turned back to the room. "Agent Rodriguez will be here within the hour. Officer Millfield, I strongly suggest you contact an attorney, because federal banking fraud carries a sentence of up to 30 years. The number hit Karen like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the conference table. 30 years, for a simple misunderstanding, for trying to protect the community. Protect the community from what? Sandra Rodriguez spoke for the first time since Karen had entered, her voice thick with disgust. From a man who's donated millions to youth programs. From a foundation that's kept hundreds of kids off the streets. What exactly were you protecting us from? Karen's silence was answer enough. Sarah Martinez lowered her phone. Officer Millfield, this footage is going to be broadcast tonight, along with expert analysis of the forged documents, interviews with banking officials, and a complete timeline of your fraudulent investigation. Do you have any comment for the families whose children benefit from Mr. Williams' Foundation? Karen looked around the room one more time, her eyes darting from face to face like a trapped animal seeking escape. But there was nowhere to run. No excuse that could explain away the evidence. No narrative that could transform her from predator to victim. I was protecting. I thought. Her voice trailed off. And for a moment, Darius almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then he remembered the word predator. Remembered the way she'd said, people like you. Remembered the look in the board members' eyes when they'd started to believe her lies. The elevator chimed again. And this time the footsteps in the hallway were multiple. Official. Purposeful. Vivian moved to the window and peered down at the street 42 floors below. There are 3 federal vehicles in the parking garage. I think your ride is here. Officer Millfield. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez entered the conference room with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen every type of financial crime the human mind could devise. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. And when she surveyed the scene, Darius could see her taking inventory of every detail. Mrs. Williams. Agent Rodriguez nodded to Vivian with the respect accorded to someone whose word carried weight in the financial community. I understand we have a situation involving forged federal banking documents. We do indeed. Vivian gestured to the scattered papers on the conference table. Officer Millfield here has been conducting what she claims is a fraud investigation using documents that bear forged Metropolitan Trust letterhead and fake federal authorization codes. Agent Rodriguez moved to the table and began examining the papers with the same methodical attention Vivian had shown, but where Vivian had been controlled. Professional. The FBI agent was clinical, detached, already building a case in her mind. These routing numbers don't exist in the federal banking database. She looked up at Karen, who had pressed herself against the far wall as if trying to disappear into the marble. These authorization codes were discontinued in 2018, and this signature. She held up one of the documents. This is supposed to be from federal Judge Patricia Hansen, but Judge Hansen has been dead for 3 years. The room went completely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Margaret's hand moved to cover her mouth again, but this time it was to suppress what might have been a gasp or a bitter laugh. Officer Millfield. Agent Rodriguez continued, her voice perfectly level. You are under arrest for federal banking fraud, impersonation of federal officials, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. She began reciting Miranda rights as 2 more agents entered the room, their presence transforming the space from a corporate boardroom into something that felt more like a courtroom. Karen's legs seemed to give out, and she slumped against the wall, her face the color of old newspaper. This isn't right, she whispered, but the words had no force behind them. I was just trying to protect the community. People like him. They come in with their money and their influence, and they think they can just take over. Take over what? Darius stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. What exactly did you think I was taking over? Officer Millfield. Karen's eyes met his for a moment, and in them, Darius saw something he'd seen too many times before. Fear. Not fear of crime or corruption or any real threat, but fear of change, fear of sharing space, fear of a world where success wasn't limited by the color of someone's skin. "You wouldn't understand," she said finally. "Try me." But Karen had nothing left to say. Agent Rodriguez nodded to her colleagues, and they moved forward with practiced efficiency, handcuffs appearing with the smooth motion of professionals who had done this many times before. As Karen was led from the room, her shoes clicking against the marble for the last time, Sarah Martinez followed with her camera rolling. This footage will be part of our special report on corruption in local law enforcement, airing tonight at 11. When the footsteps faded and the elevator doors closed, the conference room felt larger somehow, as if the space had expanded to fill the void left by Karen's toxic presence. Darius sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 43 years. Vivian moved to stand behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders. "Are you all right?" He reached up to cover one of her hands with his own. "I'm tired. Viv. Tired of having to prove I belong everywhere I go. Tired of people assuming the worst about me before they know anything about who I am or what I do." "I know." Her voice was soft, but underneath the tenderness was a steel that had carried her through every glass ceiling she'd ever shattered. "But look around this room. Look at these people who know you, who've worked with you, who've seen what you've built." Darius looked up to see Margaret still standing beside his chair, her face fierce with loyalty. James Harrison had moved closer too, his earlier hesitation replaced by something that looked like shame mixed with determination. Sandra Rodriguez was gathering the forged documents, her movements sharp with anger. Michael Torres was already on his phone, presumably canceling whatever appointments he'd made for the evening. "Darius," Margaret said quietly, "I want you to know that the Foundation's board stands behind you completely. Not just now, after the truth came out, but from the moment that woman walked in here. We should have demanded proof, should have insisted on proper procedures." James nodded emphatically. "Margaret's right. We let ourselves be intimidated by the uniform and the theatrics. That won't happen again." "It shouldn't have happened the first time." Sandra's voice was tight with controlled anger. "The work you've done with the Foundation, the lives you've changed, the community impact, none of that should have been in question for even a moment." Agent Rodriguez, who had been quietly collecting the forged documents as evidence, looked up from her work. "Mr. Williams, I want you to know that the Bureau takes these kinds of cases very seriously. Officer Millfield will face federal charges that carry significant prison time. This investigation will also trigger a review of the entire HOA system in this district." David Chen, who had been documenting everything on his phone, stepped forward. "Darius, I think we should also consider civil action. The damage to your reputation, the disruption to the Foundation's work, the emotional distress. There are grounds for a substantial lawsuit." Darius was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the events of the evening, but the broader implications. Karen Millfield wasn't an anomaly. She was a symptom of something larger, something more pervasive. And while her arrest might satisfy the need for justice, it wouldn't address the underlying disease. "David, I want you to look into establishing a legal defense fund," he said finally. "Not for me, but for other entrepreneurs, other community leaders who might find themselves in similar situations, people who don't have the resources to fight back against false accusations." Vivian squeezed his shoulders. "The bank would be happy to administer such a fund. Pro bono. Of course." Margaret was nodding before Darius finished speaking. "The Foundation Board will vote on it tomorrow, but I can guarantee it will pass unanimously. This is exactly the kind of systemic change we should be supporting." Sarah Martinez, who had been quietly recording the conversation, stepped forward. "Mr. Williams, would you be willing to do an exclusive interview about tonight's events? The public needs to understand not just what happened here, but why it happened." Darius looked around the room at the faces that had moved from suspicion to support, from doubt to determination. "Yes, but I want the focus to be on the foundation's work, on the kids we're helping, the communities we're supporting. Karen Millfield's story ends tonight. Our story continues tomorrow." Agent Rodriguez finished packing the evidence and stood to leave. "Mr. Williams, you'll need to make a formal statement, but that can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, go home to your family. The Bureau will handle everything else." As the various officials and reporters filed out of the conference room, the board members began to disperse as well, but not before each one made a point of shaking Darius's hand, of looking him in the eye, of promising their continued support. When the room was finally empty, except for Darius, Vivian, Margaret, and David, the silence felt different than it had earlier. Cleaner, hopeful. "So," Margaret said, settling back into her chair, "where were we before we were so rudely interrupted?" Darius laughed, and the sound seemed to echo off the marble floors and mahogany walls, filling the space with something it had been missing all evening: joy. "I believe we were discussing how the Riverside Youth Foundation was going to change 3,000 lives." 3,000, and counting, Vivian added, moving to take the seat Karen had vacated. "Because after tonight's news coverage, I suspect our donation calls are going to be ringing off the hook." She was right. By the time Sarah Martinez's report aired at 11 o'clock, featuring exclusive footage of Karen's arrest and interviews with banking officials explaining the sophistication of the fraud attempt, the foundation's website had crashed from the volume of traffic. The phone lines were jammed with calls from potential donors, community leaders, and other foundations wanting to partner on expanded programs. The story went national within hours, picked up by networks across the country as an example of both the persistence of racial bias in America and the power of communities to rally around truth and justice. Op-ed writers weighed in on the broader implications. Civil rights organizations cited it as evidence of the need for criminal justice reform. Banking officials used it to highlight the sophistication of modern financial fraud. But, for Darius, sitting in his living room at 2 in the morning, reading emails from kids who had benefited from the foundation's programs, the broader implications mattered less than the individual stories. Marcus, the 15-year-old with the bright eyes and worn sneakers, had sent a message simply saying, "Thank you for not giving up on us." Sheila, the single mother, had written a longer note about how the after-school program had given her son not just a safe place to go, but a sense of possibility she'd thought was lost forever. Karen Millfield pled guilty to federal fraud charges 6 months later, accepting a plea bargain that sent her to prison for 8 years and required her to pay full restitution for the legal costs and damages caused by her false accusations. The HOA system in Riverside was completely overhauled, with new oversight mechanisms and training programs designed to prevent future abuses of power. The legal defense fund Darius had proposed grew into a national foundation that provided resources for entrepreneurs and community leaders facing frivolous accusations. The original Riverside Youth Foundation expanded its programs to serve over 5,000 young people across 3 states. Funded by donations that poured in from people who had been moved by the story of one man's refusal to be broken by prejudice and lies. But perhaps the most important change was less visible, more personal. In boardrooms and community centers, in banks and schools, people began asking different questions when accusations were made. They demanded evidence before accepting guilt. They looked beyond the uniform to examine the motives behind the badge. They remembered that in America, Innocence is supposed to be presumed, not proven. And in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a downtown office building, where mahogany gleamed under LED lights and floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a city full of possibility. The work continued. Plans were made. Programs were funded. Lives were changed. The word predator had been replaced by words like partner and leader and friend. Because sometimes, justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. Sometimes, it's about refusing to let their guilt define your innocence. Sometimes, it's about building something so strong, so positive, so undeniably good that no amount of prejudice can tear it down. Sometimes, it's about proving that the only thing more powerful than fear is hope, backed by truth, supported by community, and built to last long after the accusers have been forgotten and the accused have become the architects of change. The city lights continued to pulse with the rhythm of life. And somewhere in those lights, a 15-year-old boy with bright eyes and new shoes was doing his homework in an after-school program that existed because one man refused to let false accusations silence his mission to make the world better. One child at a time,